Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about the Sinestro Corps War. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it went in the comics, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how it went in our game and the differences between the two. And in my opinion, it's maybe about 50-50 there, where half the stuff that happened in the comics happened in our game, the other half we couldn't do because of earlier adventures we had ran that would have contradicted that. But before we get into all that, make sure you smash that like button, check to see if you're still subscribed, and as always, leave us a comment. That helps us out on our end with the YouTube algorithm, and also we love hearing from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, all right, all that said, let's get into this. So, in the comics, the gist of the Sinestro Corps War is Sinestro starts giving out yellow power rings like they're Cracker Jack prizes to a lot of the really major villains in the DC universe. So one of the villains he gives a ring to is the Anti-Monitor, who was the main guy, main villain, I mean, from the Crisis on Infinite Earths. So it really doesn't get any bigger than him, right? And so here's the first problem that I ran into as a game master is we sort of erased our anti-monitor from existence at the end of our crisis, right? So in the comics, the Manhunter androids kind of put the anti-monitor back together again. We could not do that, right? So we had to do something different. So in our version, we said that, like, I don't know if you're familiar with what quantum computing actually is or the sort of urban legends around quantum computing. Real quick, in a nutshell, the idea is like, let's say you've got two parallel dimensions, like Earth 1 and Earth 2. Let's say you have a quantum computer on Earth 1 and a quantum computer on Earth 2. As I understand it, they're saying that the two computers, despite the fact they're in other universes, are able to talk to each other because of quantum entanglement, which means that like particles in the hard drive on Earth 1 are quantum entangled with particles in the hard drive on Earth 2, right? Allowing communication. So the me of Earth 1 could then send an email to the me of Earth 2, right? So now that you understand that concept, for anyone who didn't before, I'm sorry if I'm stating the obvious because some people are already familiar with that sort of thing. But at any rate, the gist is then that was how our Manhunter androids were able to communicate with other Manhunter androids in other realities, right? And so even though we had erased the anti-monitor from our game world, the Manhunter androids learned of the existence of other anti-monitors from other timelines and stuff like that, right? So because of that, then they were able to build a robotic replica of the anti-monitor, which we referred to as Anti-Monitor 2, because that's kind of the naming conventions that the DC Heroes role-playing game tends to go with. So we got the inspiration from Anti-Monitor 2 from the Green Lantern animated series. In that, he wasn't like this huge, sort of undead looking cosmic being. He was just a gigantic robot, you know? So that's what we did. And so the version we had then in our game was a robot, and he is given a yellow power ring. So there you can see kind of what I'm talking about with this whole video about some things are going to be similar, some things are not going to be the same. Um, Mongol. Mongol is a Superman villain who I always thought he's kind of like another Darkseid. But whereas Darkseid has this kind of like massive empire and all these resources and parademons and just all that jazz, Mongol doesn't have as much, right? But I don't want to paint Mongol as like a crappy Darkseid and have you think Mongol is like just a you can blow him off and he's not a big deal or whatever. He really is. He's a huge deal. He is an A-list villain. And in my opinion, by the way, people don't do enough with them. We need really more Mongol stories. But point being, um, when the Imperiex saga happened in the comics, and Imperiex was kind of like DC came up with sort of a souped up version of Galactus that doesn't just eat planets. He destroys on like a much larger scale, right? In order to fight Imperiex, Mongol had to train Superman. And what seems to happen in those comics is they take Superman from kind of that John Byrne, Man of Steel era Superman, who's like much more watered down and stuff than the Superman we're used to for that. And he's no longer watered down then. Because of this training, he goes back to what seems to be pre crisis power levels. And we see Superman doing a lot of pre crisis stuff after that story. But that was because of Mongol, right? So this is what I'm trying to set up is like Mongol's a big deal, right? And he has a planet, just as Darkseid has the planet Apocalypse. Mongol has a planet called Warworld, and as it just so happens, Warworld is where the yellow central power battery is located. Um, and then the way in the comics they defeat the Anti-Monitor is they hit him with Warworld, and they use the yellow central power battery as like a bomb. And one of the things that happens there is there's a character called the Cyborg Superman, and he's a villain from the death of Superman. And he kind of looks like Superman, but he also kind of looks like a Terminator, where like part of his face is skin and the other part is like, metallic skull, stuff like that. He used to be this guy named Hank Henshaw, and at this point in the comic book, he's just tired of living and he doesn't want to do that anymore, right? So they hit him with a planet and take him out. Um, in our game, it was a little different. So in our game, he was an astronaut named Hank Henshaw, and he actually fell in love with Lana Lang and married her. And something happened. I don't want to retell the whole story. It's in a previous video on my channel, but his body gets damaged by cosmic rays. His mind is transferred into a clone of Superman. Is one of the reasons Lana falls in love with him is because he looks like Superman, right? But they got married and had kids and stuff like that. But then it's a story about like a fall from grace or whatever, where he slowly becomes a villain. So by the time the early '90s rolled around, he was a villain in our version of the Death of Superman story, right? And so again, kind of following the comics, we say now, that it's more than 10 years later. He misses Lana. He's never getting her back. That ship has sailed, and he just doesn't want to live anymore. Um, so he gets a yellow ring. He's in the story. And we just had people, by the way, beat on him until he ran out of hit points. We didn't need to hit him with a planet. I didn't really want my characters, trying to bring War World into Earth or detonate that level of a bomb right off the coast of America. That seems like just a recipe for disaster. Um, and then Superboy Prime, and then this is maybe the big one. Superboy Prime in the comics was supposed to be from the real world and like our world. And to make a long story short, he ends up in the mainstream DC universe. He has adventures with Superman, so on and so forth. Um, he ended up in the Crisis on Infinite Earths. Um, and DC decided to make him a villain, and I hated that. I don't think he should be a villain at all. I actually think that's a great example of what I think is wrong with comics these days. But at any rate, and it's like hardly anything happens either. If you read the issue where he becomes a villain, it's like he accidentally kills somebody, and now he's just, a mustache twirling villain. You know what I mean? I just thought it was so stupid. But at any rate, So they in the comics, he gets a yellow ring, and then at one point, the Manhunter androids are uh, putting the Anti-Monitor's armor on him, and they just make him out to be the big bad. And then one of the other things that they seem to hint at is because he comes from a pre-crisis continuity, he therefore has that like crazy high pre-crisis power level. And they're saying that the post-crisis characters can't possibly stop him then. Well, that would have worked pretty well before that Imperiac story. Like I said, Mongol got Superman back up to that level. And really, when things like that happen, the thing is, Mongol didn't train Wonder Woman or the Martian Manhunter or anybody else that has like Superman adjacent strength levels, right? What really happens is DC on sort of the editorial end just says, you know what? It's not the 90s anymore. We don't like these sort of lower power levels. Let's just go back to what people liked. And by the way, um, you're going to think this is completely not relevant, but I think it is. Stuff like Dragon Ball Z had gotten popular at this point, right? Whereas it was not really a thing back when John Byrne was doing Man of Steel. And so the DC guys who are going around to conventions and stuff, they're listening to all the fanboys talk about how all this like really, really high end stuff Goku can do and how he could, beat up Superman and blah, 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 blah. And you want to think that that wouldn't have an effect on publishing and major corporations, but it absolutely does. I've talked to way too many people about that subject, and that absolutely changes things. And then also Marvel had, before, back in the old days of like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, when they were more hands-on and stuff. I mean, for that matter, when Jack Kirby was alive, obviously. Um, they were really pushing grounded stories as a way to compete with DC because when DC had stuff like pre-crisis Superboy would tow an entire galaxy on his shoulder behind him, where he had like taken a gigantic chain and threaded it through a bunch of planets, like thread, through like the popcorn you put on a Christmas tree, for instance. Um, he was just towing all these planets at the same time, and he's like 8 years old at the time or something. You know what I mean? So Marvel thought those stories were ridiculous, and they didn't want to tell high-end stories back then. They wanted to tell more grounded stuff. So they had characters like, say, Cyclops, who's basically a normal guy, but with an optic blast, right? Or, whatever. Or Angel, Warren Worthington, was like a normal guy, but he had wings. You know what I mean? So Marvel's whole approach had been low level characters that they wanted them to be more relatable and stuff like that. And one of their things is the Marvel universe is the universe right outside your window. That was a big phrase Stan used to say back in the day. Well, you get to this point in time, publishing wise, and Marvel had abandoned that. Marvel starts telling stories where, like, Silver Surfer goes back to Galactus, and the thing that Galactus did to change the Silver Surfer from Norrin Rad into the Surfer, Galactus gives him like a double dose. So Surfer is now like doubly cosmic, or whatever, however you want to look at that, right? And Marvel had characters like Sentry and stuff where they were amping stuff up. And my long-winded point is, so at this point, we should not be thinking of the DC characters as post-crisis characters anymore in terms of power level, right? They are on par with they were where they were before that. And in some cases, we actually see him doing more than they did before that. A lot of the stuff that the Martian Manhunter was doing was like the most powerful he had ever been ever. Wonder Woman, I think, was doing stuff that was way, way more powerful than the stuff that the pre-crisis Wonder Woman was doing. But I digress. The point is, so in the comic, when they say that these guys can't handle Superboy Prime, and I mean just by himself, even without taking into account that he's wearing anti-monitor armor, which to me was the effects of the armor was not super well defined, but at any rate, it just didn't make sense to me, right? But that being the big climax of the story that he's so hard to deal with, that whole thing went out the window for us because our Superboy that we used was the clone Superboy from the Death of Superman. And he had been established at that point to have the DNA of Lex Luthor. At one point, he'd shaved his head. He wanted to take more after Luthor than Superman, which a lot of people forget that ever happened. He started wearing black. He fought Superman on multiple occasions, saying stuff like, I didn't ask to be made. I never asked to live in your shadow. They had a comic book where he was a straight up villain called Black Zero, right? So we just thought he was the better fit because the thing with Superboy Prime is he's from Earth Prime. So therefore, there's only one Earth Prime. So there can only be in the multiverse one Superboy Prime, right? And actual DC Comics is using him. So we can't have him show up on Earth K. So we need to do something else. So we went with Connell, the clone, who in our world had been kind of more of a villain than he had even been in the comics. And he had fought the 1980s Superboy, who was the son of the pre-crisis Superman. And at this point in our comic, our game's timeline now, he is our Superman, right? So we don't really need Connell around. So we decided to make him the villain. We gave Connell the ring. He still had the same sour attitude he always had. And in the end, he just got beat down. That's how they defeated him. They just beat him down. Um, because in the comics, there's a one of the Owens self-destructs, which I thought was very strange. And that sends him into another universe, only for him to return later. So we just beat him up and imprisoned him. Um, let's see, what have I not said? I guess the last thing I'll say, well, so we did everybody dog piles then the anti-monitor, who now is anti-monitor 2, who's a robot. Um, and they defeat him, and then after the story, kind of the epilogue to it, is he is turned into the power battery for the Black Lantern Corps that's coming. Because that's another thing going on in the comics is they keep talking about the prophecy of Blackest Night. And that's where all this is going. Kind of like part one of the story is Yellow Lantern Corps. Part two is like all the colors all fighting each other. Part three is Blackest Night, which is the Black Lanterns, and it's a big zombie apocalypse story. And then part four is Brightest Day, which I thought was a huge letdown. I was totally on board. They'd gotten me back into comics. And then when Brightest Day happened, I hated how it ended. But at any rate, trying to think if there's anything I left out. Oh, Sornik Natu. She in the comics is the daughter of Sinestro. And interestingly enough, we had already introduced a character with the same skin color as her dad and so on and so forth. We kind of had this stand-in for Sinestro that was a female character. And she didn't have a name yet. We were just calling her the Yellow Lantern. Um, so it's kind of funny when all this came out, and our character predates the first appearance of Sornik Natu in the comics. But when we saw the name, we used it. And unlike the comics where she's a Green Lantern for a while and then she becomes a Yellow Lantern, we just had ours be a Yellow Lantern the whole time. And something else they did in the comics was a yellow ring goes to Batman and basically tells him, you have the ability to instill great fear in others. We want you for the Sinestro Corps. Um, but then it senses that Batman had used a green ring at one point in his past, and so it sees him as kind of like tainted or corrupted or whatever, and it abandons him and leaves. And then Batman goes and tells the Justice League what just happened, like, "Hey, so apparently there's something called a Sinestro Corps. That sounds like a bad idea." Um, well, so uh, again, we couldn't quite do that in our game because our current Batman is Batman Beyond, Terry McGinnis, right? And in my humble opinion, he's not No, he's not Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne is scarier than Terry. I feel like Terry is more of kind of like a Spider-Man kind of a guy. But I want to mention Batman because, Batman scares people for a reason, and it's because he means well, right? And the thing is, because there's certain elements of this story where I feel like the story can't decide if it wants to be shades of gray, where it's like morally ambiguous in the comics, I mean, or does it want to be like, no, 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 these guys are straight up bad? Because when it starts off and it is focusing on Sinestro, they're saying that his motivation was that he sees everything that's wrong in the universe. He sees crime and he sees war and suffering and stuff like that. And he doesn't like it. And he wants to bring order to everything and he wants to eliminate those things. And so early in his life, if he would just go up to someone doing evil stuff, and if you're like, hey, could you not be evil? Like, they're not going to listen to you. You know what I mean? But if you threaten them and if you have the power to follow through on your threats and you scare them into knocking it off, right? Which is how a lot of things work in real life, he sees that. And so that's his whole thing. And so when we ran it, I decided the best way to run it would be to not only have player characters who were Green Lanterns, but to also have player characters that were Yellow Lanterns or members of the Sinestro Corps, which we called them the Yellow Lantern Corps. But we for our game did decide to make it kind of like, at least when it started, some of the Yellow Lanterns had a point. And one of the reasons we'd done that was because over the years, like for instance, Chris Cross, he used to play a Green Lantern in our game for a really long time. And then at one point he actually ended up with Sinestro's old ring, the yellow ring. And in the game, they give it to in DC Heroes, I mean third edition, they give it to Guy Gardner. It's on his character sheet. So Kroos had that ring for a while, and Kroos was a Yellow Lantern for a while, like in the '90s, the late '90s or whatever. Or actually, that's a little too early. I guess it would be the early 2000s. Whatever. It kind of doesn't matter. But the point was, we had heroic Yellow Lanterns in our game before this. So I didn't want to say these guys are just mustache twirling, two-dimensional villains. And you know what I mean? I kind of did that more with the Red Lanterns. But with the Yellow Lanterns, I kind of said, if the Red Ones are just, for the most part, they're like chaotic evil. And if the Green Lanterns are either lawful good or you could argue lawful neutral, maybe, um, I thought, well, the yellow ones need to be somewhere in between the two. And so we came up with this idea that they were like kind of like anti-heroes in a way, like a bunch of them, not all of them, of course, not like say, Superboy, who I said we gave a ring to. He's like in our game, like just a villain at this point, straight up villain, doing the Black Zero thing. Um, but a bunch of the others were like trying to be Batman. That's one of the reasons I brought up Batman is Batman uses fear to try to accomplish something good, right? Some of the yellow ones were doing that. And then some of the Green Lanterns in our game were jerks. And there have been plenty of examples in the comics of guys, whether it's like Guy Gardner or Jack Chance or whoever it is, there are Green Lanterns who are just a-holes, right? So our version was a kind of a more morally gray thing. It was a massive fight between the two. It was like a series of skirmishes and stuff. And for us, um, the Yellow Lanterns aren't like all, whatever, defeated and killed or defeated and thrown in the Phantom Zone or something like that, because they show up again in the next chapter of the story, the War of Light, with all the different colors all going at it at once. So we needed to keep them around for that. But that's about it for this one. And to be specific, I guess I didn't say it. The Green Lanterns beat the Yellow Lanterns on Earth. They have a big fight on the West Coast. And when the smoke settles, the dust settles, the Yellow Lanterns call retreat. They go back into space. Oh, and I left a big part out, which is so we mentioned John Redbridge ad nauseum on this channel, of course, because he's the guy who's been played more than any other character in our game. He's an original character. Um, there's multiples of him. He had a run in with this guy named Mr. Splits who could create duplicates of people, yada yada. Check out the Mr. Splits video if you haven't already. But the point is, so there's a bunch of John Redbridges, right? And one of them actually becomes a Yellow Lantern. And like I said, that was that Batman kind of thing. So interestingly enough, we saw, and I've mentioned this before, and I felt like this kind of punctuated that the John Redbridges, they used to be the same guy, but they've been living different lives, having different experiences. They're slowly becoming different people. And so then in this story, two of them fought, and one has a green ring and one has a yellow ring. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And it was also interesting because we'd done stories before where it's kind of like, well, yeah, well, this guy's a hero and this guy's like from the negative universe or whatever, where he's just chaotic evil, and the lawful good guy fights the chaotic evil guy. That wasn't what this was. These two guys were like almost like two guys that were kind of like chaotic good, but they couldn't agree on how to go about things. And for me that was way more interesting, so I liked that too. But this was a pretty good game. Well, not a single game, it was a series of games, but I mean, this was a good chapter in our game world. I liked this. I thought it set up a lot of good stuff, and I liked the War of Light, which is what comes next, so we're going to be talking about that in tomorrow's video. So hopefully you liked this one. If so, as always, you know the routine. Smash that like button. Check to make sure you're still subscribed. And as always, leave us a comment. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one. And we'll catch you in the next adventure.